Good afternoon from Austin, Texas. On behalf of the NMC, I'm delighted to welcome you to the NMC Beyond the Horizon Black Swans. As you can see below, we have a map showing where you all are tuning in from. So we have definitely spread across the United States and somebody tuning in from Croatia. So thank you for taking time to meet with us today. The NMC Horizon project has built an enviable record of highlighting emerging trends and technologies for more than 12 years. But even the best, most proactive environmental scanning can't predict black swans. As Nassim Taleb called them in his landmark book, The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable. For this edition of the NMC Beyond the Horizon, we will have a focused conversation on the possible futures of technologies currently within our grasp: internet privacy, the network, and machine learning, through both utopian and dystopian lenses. I'm your host today, Alex Freeman, Director of Special Membership and Special Projects at the NMC. I'm joined by the NMC's Gordon Jackson, who is here to assist with technical support. Now on to the moderator for today's program, Dr. Ruben Puentedura. Dr. Puentedura is the founder and president of Hippasus, a consulting practice based in Western Massachusetts, which I imagine is experiencing a very nice fall at this time of year. He's interested in focusing on transformative applications of information technologies to education. He has implemented these approaches for over 25 years at a range of K through 20 educational institutions, as well as health and arts organizations. His current work explores the directions in mobile computing, digital storytelling, learning analytics, and educational gaming, focusing on applications in areas where they have not been traditionally employed. I'd like to turn it over to Ruben. Take it away.
All right. So thank you very much, Alex. Good afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome wherever you're joining us from. Today we're going to be talking about black swans. Now, what's a black swan? Well, you could say it's a very large bird, and that would be true, but that's not quite the sense in which we're going to be talking about black swans today. We're going to be talking about black swans as events that have three very important characteristics. The first characteristic of a black swan is that it's an event that is unpredictable ahead of time. So you would say, well, for instance, the economic crash of 2008, anybody who told you that it was predictable ahead of time was quite simply lying. Nobody predicted it ahead of time. However, it had the second characteristic of a black swan event: a major impact on the world around it. In other words, what happened as a result was that economic systems, both in the US and worldwide, were completely and totally transformed. So with that in hand, we can now go to the third characteristic of a black swan event. And the third characteristic of a black swan event is that in retrospect, a black swan event seems to be predictable. At the very least, we can explain it, we can rationalize it retrospectively. So now you've had a whole spate of books on the economic crash of 2008 that say, oh, of course, we should have seen it coming, except we didn't. And we couldn't have, in fact. And those three are the characteristics of a black swan event. Not predictable ahead of time, has a huge impact on the world around it, and finally, after it happens, we can rationalize it. We can say, okay, that's why it happened. Great. So that's a black swan event. How does it impact us in education? Well, any event of this sort is going to be of great importance, great impact to us in education, whether it's a question of whether students know how to deal with a situation such as the one that occurred in 2008, or also the impact on our systems. In other words, how should our schools, universities, colleges respond to black swan events? And we might be tempted to say, well, okay, what we do is we just make them rugged, rigid, so that nothing can buffet us. We will stand still among the storms swirling around us. Trouble is, that doesn't work very well. There's no level of, so we say, preparation that you could have put in place that would have allowed you to go through the economic storm of 2008 unaffected. And what's more, systems that tend to be built up too much to resist changes of the events that might occur tend to actually break when faced with this type of change. So that's not a very good approach. What else could we do? Well, another approach would be to say, well, while we can't predict black swan events, we can at the very least frame our thinking so that when the event happens, well, we can actually know how to respond to it. We couldn't predict it, but we can be, if you will, in a more flexible position, which gets us into the third aspect of responding to black swan events. When we start thinking about a more flexible response to the black swan events, we also realize that we can actually look at them from a different perspective, where we're not just looking at avoiding black swan events, but actually saying, well, in the midst of a black swan event, can we see how we might be able to benefit from it? Can we see how we might be able to perhaps change how we do things, what we do, in a way that actually in some way isn't just hurt by a black swan event, but actually, as I say, provides some beneficial context to it. And in this sense, there's an additional concept that can be of use in this regard, and it's the notion of the edge of chaos. There's been quite a bit of study on this topic in the domain of complex systems. And we speak of the edge of chaos as that region between utter rigidity and utterly chaotic systems where creation occurs, where, for instance, it seems that systems that evolve and evolve effectively seem to reside, where there's room for creativity. So in fact, we can look at how we think about black swan events as a way of finding and helping define this edge of chaos, as I say, not just in the negative sense of a pure response to a black swan event, but also in a creative sense, in the sense that might help our institutions evolve, develop, change how they think, how they create, what they do, etc., in ways that are new and previously unexpected, and yet completely rational in retrospect. Fine. So today we're going to start thinking about black swan events. And to do this, we're going to take a cue from the Horizon report, and we're going to look at three areas: internet privacy, the network, and machine learning, so that we can see these three areas derived from the work of the Horizon report, how they might play out, how they might have relevance to the type of black swan events that might arise in the future. Again, we're not playing a game of let's predict the next black swan event. That can't be done. Instead, we're saying by looking at the network, internet privacy, and machine learning and the connections between the three of them, we're saying that by looking at them, we can be better prepared to think about what might be done in the case of such an upcoming event. And to do that, we've asked our panelists each then to focus on one of these. So I think we're going to lead off now, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Lev Gonik. Lev is the co-founder and CEO of One Community, which is a nonprofit organization enabling and celebrating innovation, collaboration, and productivity through next-generation broadband networks and services throughout Northeast Ohio. And Lev is going to be talking about the network. So after Lev, we'll hear also from Alexander, and then after that, we'll hear from Wendy Shapiro. Finally, Tom Haynes will make some commentary, and then we'll start to riff on these three concepts in both a utopian and a dystopian sense. But we'll come back to that later. So at this point, I'll turn the mic over to Lev. Go ahead, Lev, please.
Thanks, Ruben. Very much appreciate the introduction, and welcome to everybody in this conversation. The net, as we know it, is just about to celebrate 50 years. And the position that I'm taking, and I firmly believe, is that in the next 50 years, we will think the first 50 years were effectively the most nascent, innocent, and utopian of the years of the century. In these first introductory remarks, really what I want to share with the community online is that our concept of the network is indeed innocent and nascent. We have managed to connect really probably 1% of all the things that we will be connecting in the next 50 years, which is, to put it the other way, 99% of all the things that remain to be connected, 99% of all the things that can be connected remain to be connected out there. And that really the network, as we know it, is the enabler of all of the conversation around machine learning. and of course raises the challenges around network privacy that we'll be talking about today. In addition to the technical capabilities, I think it's also important to point out that the market value of the network is also today, even though we think of it as a tremendous source of innovation and capital, is indeed really going to explode in terms of its value because so many more devices and services will be brought on the network. We probably are looking at something on the order right now of about 150 or so billion devices and machines being connected to the network. Again, about 99% of all the things that are out there still to be connected in probably the next 5 to 10 years, at least the largest part of them along the way. And the value here is really measured in trillions of dollars, and probably, again, conservatively is looking in the order of somewhere between 15 and 20 trillion dollars worth of value. The impact, obviously, on the teaching and learning experience, again, I think behooves us to be thinking here about really significant, not arithmetic, but exponential change and impact on the teaching and learning and research enterprise, as well as the community service piece of all of the work that we do. Finally, just to sort of tee this up, I always think and talk about the network as really a Tower of Babel when we think about kind of how the network is going to continue to evolve. The Tower of Babel actually has two meanings, one utopian and one dystopian, and we'll be talking a lot more about that in the next round. But the Tower of Babel initially started off as the idea in Arabic of actually the gateway to the heavens, a unified, integrated sense of the utopian opportunity that lies ahead of us. That's Babel El. And of course, you know probably from the colloquial way in which we use the Tower of Babel today that it actually has to do with complete discontinuity and in many ways a reflection of the many challenges that we face when we think about creating unified, universal visions of the future in terms of the network, and really the notion that the Tower of Babel is actually in the end a celebration of the heterogeneity of the human creative process. So we'll be coming back to more of those, and with that, I think my job is to pass it over to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That was a wonderful introduction. So now I'll turn it over to Brian Alexander. Brian is going to talk with us now about the topic of machine learning. He comes to us from Vermont, from Brian Alexander Consulting, where he works in each and every single aspect that I can imagine of technology and education with colleges and universities. And I might add, where he has been traveling throughout New England, and our paths have crossed repeatedly over the past few days. So, Brian, take it away, please.
Thank you, Ruben. I'm going to be discussing what I think of as the very boldest of the black swans, and that is what Ruben and I have been calling machine learning. And we don't mean machine learning in the narrow sense of how we can use neural networks to improve an algorithm's ability to understand information. Instead, we mean the combined enterprise of artificial intelligence and robotics, advancing rapidly to have a huge impact on human civilization, including teaching and learning. We think there are a few ways this can happen. One part is that continuous developments in artificial intelligence, learning science, both neuroscience and psychology, human-computer interaction and interfaces. We also think that we're seeing governmental, commercial, and academic projects happening at a high clip. There's a lot of research, a lot of R&D, rapid iteration. At the same time, the open education movement has made available enormous amounts of information for artificial intelligences to chew on, giving them a great deal of background. They already, in fact, potentially more learned than we are. On top of this is the sheer rapid development of technology, where we go from every month adding more hardware, more processing speed, more memory. We're accustomed to this, but it's important to think about how far we've gone in 9 years and how far we'll go 9 years from now. I call this the Tutor Me Siri mode, where we should imagine that we'll have access to personal tutors in software form. We've been talking about this for some time, since the 90s, if not the 80s. But I think in many ways now we're really experiencing how it can actually work. So imagine a basic form of a tutor, say Duolingo but on steroids, where it'd be trivial for us to quickly download an app that can teach us the American Civil War, or French, or human anatomy. And imagine this at the commodity level, where any individual person can get this, but also at the enterprise level, where business can deploy this, or a school. And when I say tutor, don't just think in terms of tutoring on a problem, helping you with calculus. I mean a broader intellectual engagement. Think of the Cambridge model of tutor, where you're basically meeting with somebody at an equal meeting of minds, and you can have many conversations lasting a great deal of time, and the tutor remembers you. In higher education, you can imagine some changes happening. Imagine computer science becoming an enormous department. And the same with robotics, because those fields are going to be powering the global economy. You can also imagine some interesting fights over scholarship. We've already seen Watson being used to expand the research that we can do in medical science. We're already seeing as well the development of programs that write certain types of writing, including business and sports journalism. Imagine in 5 years seeing a medical paper co-authored with Watson. Imagine 5 years past that. And moreover, like with MOOCs, imagine seeing a split in two, where sciences and the statistically oriented social sciences rapidly race ahead with this, and the humanities and the less quantitatively intensive social sciences are slower to go, in part because the former are easier to quantify than the latter. There's a wonderful book to read on this, a recent book called The Second Machine Age by Brynjolfsson and McAfee. I'm going to return to that later on. But before we go into Utopia, let me hold back and give the mic over to our next person.
All right. So thank you, Brian. And at this point, I think it's now time to hear from Wendy. And Wendy will be talking about the topic of internet privacy. She comes to us from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she's the associate dean. So Wendy, your turn.
Well, thank you, Ruben, and thank you, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be with my colleagues, and as well as all my colleagues out there on the net. I get the pleasure of, in some ways, bringing us right to the reality that touches us every single day. It's nearly impossible to spend a single day without logging onto the internet, getting onto the network. We email and text and buy and learn and analyze and socialize. In fact, we're on an online forum right now. So is NMC gathering data on us? So what about this? What does privacy on the internet mean to you? This is a question that the minute you raise it, everybody jumps into the discussion. Because we know that when we get on, this is not a secret anymore, we know when we get on the computer that it is gathering the information on websites we visited, documents and pictures and videos and our passwords, our bank and our credit cards, and of course, shopping. And once you're on the network, once you're on the internet, nearly every website in the world is using a third-party service to track us. Now, I don't mean to go positive or negative here. I am trying to be very neutral. So unless you're using blockers, much of our behavior is being funneled into big analytic companies, into the cloud, and a very common one is Google. So we often think about convenience versus privacy. And a very obvious situation is we really would prefer to just click on a field and all of our information gets filled in. And that is definitely convenient. But then you say, well, what about my privacy? Well, how much information are they gathering on me? A conversation, certainly some people say there is no more privacy. Others say this is not okay. I don't want people to know all this about me. There was an interesting conversation this morning where a colleague said, I don't care if the world knows about me, but I don't want my neighbors to know things about me. So that was an interesting insight. Most of what I'm going to address in the future of our conversations today is going to focus on learning. So when you talk about internet privacy and you talk about learning, and just as a quick overview, to think about there's potentials and there's pitfalls. Very quickly, potentials on being on the internet with machine learning. You know, things can become personalized. Brian did a very good overview in explaining that. It can adapt to your learning styles and your needs. You can become highly immersive with possibilities. It certainly is saying that now, based on machine learning with these algorithms, with these formulas, that you can discover students at risk. And now what are pitfalls? Pitfalls come about, students can be maybe too closely monitored. These algorithms take away the qualitative nature of working with students. There's a loss of identity in big data. And what happens when the analytics makes decisions for the students and the students lose control? So that is the way we begin the journey in the internet privacy, and I am going to turn this back over to Ruben.
All right. Thank you. That was a great introduction, Wendy. And now I want to introduce our final panelist. And this would be Tom Hames. And Tom is coming in from Houston Community College, where he's the Director of Technology and Instructional Computing. And Tom is going to play a very special role, because when we're thinking about black swans, just going through a simple, okay, then X, then Y, then Z methodology will not quite suffice. I've asked Tom to be, well, a little bit of a gadfly today, to come in and comment on what people have said, to get our minds thinking in different directions, again, to get us working at that edge of chaos in creative and interesting ways. So, take it away, Tom, please.
Well, yes, I'm the one who has to respond to everybody else's prepared remarks, so I have to sort of riff it on along the way. But I did you know, sort of think about what I thought everybody else was going to say a little bit ahead of time, and one of the things that I really want to point out is that black swans occur, but humans often don't move at the speed of the change. As a matter of fact, it's unusual for that to happen. And so one of the reasons that black swans are so discombobulating is that the world suddenly spins away from everyone's understanding of the way it should work. And so we tend to fall back upon things that we know, and that's a natural human trait. You know, fear is often one of the first responses to that, and fear of change. You will see organizations, you will see individuals resisting change, and even planned change that's careful and thought through requires a lot of planning, and it requires a lot of massaging along the way. You can't just sort of assume, okay, we're going to put computer labs everywhere and everybody will suddenly know how to use computers, or take advantage of the internet for something that's actually useful, or what is useful, and all these sorts of questions arise. So, and then people get afraid of things like privacy issues. People get afraid of being watched. People get afraid of being tracked. And to, you know, frankly, a lot of the people who live outside of our technological bubble live very much like they did even 20, 30, 40 years ago. You know, I remember I was in a pet store not 3 or 4 weeks ago where a woman got very angry at the teller because the teller, or the cashier, did not know how to fill out a check for her. So, you know, things like that still are very much, you know, people are very set in their ways. And so one of our jobs, I think, as educational leaders is to work out mechanisms that will smooth the transition for those people within our respective societies at our institutions, and also for our students and society at large. I mean, I think we have a role to play as leaders there. And that's not necessarily a predictive thing, it's a reactive thing in a way, but if you can predict the way things are starting to pivot, then maybe you can plan that transition a little more effectively, because it doesn't happen overnight no matter what you do. So organizational change, I think, is going to be a massive issue in all of these topic areas, and you know, we shouldn't lose track of the fact that organizations, like Charlton Heston says, organizations are people, right?
All right. Thank you, Tom. So now we've got the setup, and we're ready to get into the, shall we say, place where we start refracting our ideas about these different topics through two key lenses. And the two key lenses are going to be, first, a utopian one, and then a dystopian one. So now we're going to hear from all of our panelists about their chosen topic from a utopian lens. What does it look from the best of all worlds, or the best of all times perspective? What would this mean? And I think this time around, let's start with Wendy. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ruben. So I like to bring this right into a reality that's tangible for at least me to understand, and I thought that I would bring the first utopian, my utopian scenario in via learning analytics, because this is something that we are all grappling with. To begin this, just to level set for all of us, you know, using a little quote from the NMC Horizon report, the goal of the learning analytics is to build better pedagogies, empower students to take an active part in their learning, target at-risk student populations, and help with retention and student success. Sounds terrific. So in the best of worlds, learning analytics collects large amounts of data, learning data. This lets us identify patterns within the learning, and then also tailor education more precisely for each student. Well, this is great. It's great for students. It's great for an institution. Students get their degrees. Institutions retain their students. It's efficient. It's great financially. And we in our utopian world say, yes, the promises are coming true. In the perfect world, learning analytics links our learning management systems to our student information systems, and really all other campus systems that collect personal patterns of student communication, ways they engage with information, and their activities. In the perfect world, all the data that's gathered belongs to the learner. And then it's up to the learner to decide how the information can be used. And therefore, they have control over how much gets out and gives them some sense of privacy. Brian had been talking about the machine learning, and I guess as a little piece of that, you know, I think about the algorithms that are used, and in the perfect scenario, in the ideal world with learning analytics, these algorithms can actually be adapted by the student, and they result in dynamic visualizations so that the students can reflect and do comparisons on where they are. So here's an example. So these algorithms are now being used to monitor how much the student is reading in their digital textbooks, their levels of engagement with interactive course content and learning forums. Then this data is cross-referenced with other aspects of their life, such as time spent working, socializing, exercising, sleeping. This data and more is compared against a vast de-identified student data repository or repositories from other campuses. And based on this, the learning behavior of the student, the pedagogy will adapt to the learner's preferences and needs with extensive feedback. And then this becomes highly interactive. And like I said, I love this idea that there's dynamic visualizations that the student themselves have access to all of this information that's coming back. And in the end, we have equalized the learning field and created a healthy and constructive society.
So that's a lovely perspective. Let's continue the dreaming then. Lev, let's hear from your perspective. What does the world of dreams look like?
Right. I want to just provide a data point for Wendy, which is actually very realistic. Today, Arizona State University has more than 50,000 students studying online. More than 80% of them have actually provided permission for data collection in what would otherwise be perceived perhaps as a bit invasive. And in fact, as I think probably most of the people in this webinar know, Arizona State is among the pioneers trying to then shape the learning environment based on the ability to track. And I think it's a good example that we can perhaps look in something less than the utopian vision for actually realizing those kinds of opportunities. But I think actually that's just the very, very beginning. Over the next 50 years, I think we can look as in reality that in the next year to three, in truth, it will be our hand-carried devices that will tell the network all about our activities to provide us with optimized opportunities for balancing out while we're in the university environment, our study, our recreational activities, our social activities. There'll be all kinds of recommender systems based on our, again, consenting to have something as simple as our mobile phones essentially track, which actually, of course, I think everyone knows today in the wireless networking world goes on actually in the shopping centers and malls of America. All of our mobile phones are pinging every 1 to 3 seconds and telling both where we are and what we're doing in terms of transacting business or simply not moving anywhere, what our patterns are for our experiences, and all that's going to be coming to the campus. Again, I think in the next 5 to 7 years, the utopian version of things is actually a whole lot more. Again, with consent becomes possible. I think you will see network-enabled services in our clothing and in obviously our shoe wear that will also tell us a lot about how we've either exercised or not exercised, whether we've slept or not slept, whether we're gaining weight or not. All of these are social determinants of our abilities to learn. A lot more actually than whether we had actually attended class last time. And so again, I think the network-connected environment provides actually for a much more holistic orientation in this utopian view of the world than actually anything that we know and what we think about today as quote-unquote learning analytics. Learning analytics, if we want to sort of use the term, is truly in its infancy, and within the next decade, I think the inputs will be much richer, much more engaged. And what's the end goal? I mean, 10 and 15 years out, I have no doubt that we will create socially acceptable implants of all kinds. There will be pills that we will swallow that will be network-enabled. There will be all kinds of opportunities to tweak the human biology in a way that will optimize to actually take a look at, again, ways of optimizing the learning moments when they do happen. All of which is to say, all of this directs us to really a data-rich environment to provide for precision. Precision medicine is obviously now a national agenda following the work of the genomics community over the last 20 years. And in the next 15 to 20 years in education, I assume that we will likewise be taking all of this rich input and creating a learning genome environment where we will be able to provide truly precision approaches and highly personalized approaches to the learning environment, not just based on a time on task and whether or not we're checking in to our online environment.
Thank you, Lev. That's a great perspective, although I have to admit I'm now trying to wrap my head around the idea of an implant as a pill. But with that in mind, now let's turn it over to Brian to get his utopian perspective.
Let's take a look at Utopia and what it means for machine learning. The main vision for this, I think, is that we assume that humans can help us, that machines can help humans rather than. So that instead of dominating us or being irrelevant, the machines play a major role, both hardware and software machines, and they assist, expand, and complement human endeavors. This could happen if a few things occur. One is that humans learn to do what machines do poorly, and machines learn to do what humans do badly. So think about, for example, repetitive tasks. Machines can do that very well when humans get tired out. Think about random creativity. Humans are great at that. Machines aren't very good right now. The second point would be that policy, government, state, that level, responds sanely to address challenges. Think, for example, if we have widespread unemployment as a result of automating a great deal of jobs, how do we account for that? Do we have something like guaranteed minimum national income? We need policy to address that in a positive way. And once that happens, we also have to assume that there is an upper limit to artificial intelligence, a limit to what robotics can actually do. So that at some point, we don't see the rapture of the nerds, we don't see some kind of spectacular super minds, but that AI can be very good, just not better than us. Robots can be pretty good at some things, but they can't replace humans. One economist had this optimistic way of looking at it. Our collective ingenuity will create so many things for people to do that they are so attractive to the rich that they will pay through the nose for them and so recreate a middle-class society. So we can have that. In higher education, you can imagine campuses with infinite curricula. If a student wants to get to learn about something, they'll have access to tutors in just about anything. We'll see, like I said before, computer science, robotics, psychology departments grow. We'll see scholarship go through a renaissance where computers can help us expand what we can create and what we can learn. And on top of that, imagine an 18-year-old in this future. For them, their high school experience won't be stultifying, but liberating. They'll have maybe half of their day devoted to one-on-one time with tutors. Imagine how much learning they have access to. What an extraordinary amount you can learn when you're 13, 15, 18. And imagine, too, that these 18-year-olds really value humans, that they haven't become machine fetishists, quite the opposite. They love us for our style, for our eccentricity. My literary model for this is a little book called A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer, which appears in Neil Stephenson's novel, The Diamond Age. If you don't know it, Google away.
Thank you, Brian. So now that we've heard the utopian aspect of things, it's time to get back to Tom, who's going to now riff on these three presentations before we go look at the darker side of things. Tom?
Yeah, sort of a common theme in all of this is, again, getting back to the idea of human societies and organizations, is that, in order to avoid the fear response to Lev's pill or some of the machines taking over learning, the key aspect there is transparency. I mean, if these things are extremely transparent processes, and I think it's time for us to societally look at that as, I hate to use the word as a political scientist, a constitutional convention, but we need to rethink how we handle transparency in this society, because where we see the biggest problems is we don't know what's happening with our data on the network, with that medical data. Some things need to be protected, some things probably don't. And so at a certain level, people just have to understand that you can't defend everything, and when you try to do that, then you're going to fail. But if you protect certain key things and do that very carefully in terms of the privacy aspects of it, then you have a chance of success. So I would say that if people know what's going on, if people have a broad sense, you have an opt-in strategy as opposed to an opt-out strategy, all of those are key watchwords as we move into these technologies in terms of how we want to proceed both institutionally and societally. And that transparency is key in mitigating the negative effects and keeping us from the dystopian views, which I'm sure we'll hear now.
So thank you, Tom. So now it's time to go to the other side of Tale of Two Cities, right? Best of all times, now it's time for worst of all times. And I think that Brian left things on an intriguing note. So let's pick up with Brian again. So what do things look like from the darker side of things, Brian?
What happens in the dystopian world? There are a lot of possibilities, starting with machines being able to blot out the human endeavor, as you can see from this cartoon. There are a lot of things that have to happen for this to take place, and the two main ones are, first, machines taking up the great majority of human functions, everything from physical labor to mental work. And secondly, for policy to either become futile or feudal. That is, that policy doesn't really help address any of this, or it reinforces some kind of nightmarish social arrangement. Imagine, for example, a new version of the 1% that own, maintain, control the machines, and the 99% are basically unemployed or serfs. To go back to that economist, Brad DeLong, his pessimistic view is as follows. Our future is one of human beings chained to desks and screens, acting as numbed mind cogs for Amazon Mechanical Turk forever. In higher education, imagine a debased form of the Virginia Tech Math Emporium, one where we have learners surrounded mostly by machines with a few ill-paid part-time people on the side who occasionally help them out. In this future, all faculty will become adjuncts, that is, part-time, no tenure, no academic freedom. On top of that, the performance is meter. They are paid by the hour, perhaps by the minute. Institutions of all kinds, campuses, museums, libraries will see enrollments and foot traffic plummet. And scholarship will either become shriveled, as we have very few people who can produce it, or it's completely automated. The 18-year-old in this world will prefer software to persons because software is so much richer and people are so depressing. The humanities and social sciences will become nearly extinct historical artifacts, and whoever provides Tutor will dominate our minds and our culture. We can go further still. There are many classic fears of what could happen, many ways in which we could have automation take over and dominate our politics. In fact, right now, there's an Oxford University initiative looking at existential threats to humans, and they're focusing very hard on trying to understand what could happen. How can we be threatened? Are we in danger of being blotted out by our machines to come? Or will humanity simply be demoted to a second rate? I think these are terrifying visions, and ones that are likely enough that we need to think hard about them.
Thank you, Brian. Now we were all nice and cheery, and now the cheer has left the room, which is, of course, what we wanted to do. So again, as those of you in our audience are thinking about this, think about the interplay between the neutral presentation, the utopian, and now the dystopian presentation. So let me turn it over at this point to Wendy, and hear how Wendy refocuses her particular topic. Wendy?
Right. Well, first of all, as this is an interesting exercise, and I would welcome anyone to try to go through some of this experience, because your head just kind of, you know, you go from this lovely place to this place of, you know, and trying to ask yourself, where are we? What is our reality? As I was thinking about the dystopia, it just brought to mind so many science fiction books that lead into this place where human civilization is crushed or it's crumbling, you know, and it's just this place that I shouldn't say, but in some ways there was a familiarity. And I am kind of a positive person, just saying. But let me go back to the dystopia. Lev had mentioned, you know, these amazing things that are going on at Arizona State in, you know, moving towards the positive, the possibilities that can turn. And I'm going to use this as to move from the learning analytics and privacy into something that is actually going on, and I won't mention names because it's not, I don't know, it's not, I don't want to mention any names. But it is about, as more and more education happens online, there continues to be traditional methods of assessment, including testing. There is a huge concern over anti-cheating, you know, anti-cheating technologies that can make sure that if the students are online taking a test, how can we guarantee that it is the person who we think it is? Well, there is a software company, which will remain nameless, and I'm sure there'll be software companies that get better at this, that are currently working with several universities. And as a student begins to take an online class, this software will record their face, you know, facial recognition. They record their knuckles. They take all their personal identification. And then as the student, so it gathers all this information right off the bat and gets information on how they use their browser. It then keeps track of all that is happening on the screen in the browser based on the student's webcam and microphone. After all this information is collected, it uses algorithms, machine learning, and facial recognition technology to monitor the face and body as the student is taking an online exam. But so put yourself in the situation where you're now taking this exam. It has all your information. You start your exam, and a red warning band comes across the screen, and it indicates that the software is now monitoring your computer and recording a video of you. It is forever reminding you that you are being watched, and the program, in so doing, shows a little live video of you on the screen. What surprised me as I was sharing some of this information with some colleagues is, in fact, this is not all that unusual. I guess I really just have not been privy to it. And this is just the beginning of our dystopia if we take this pathway of taking privacy and identity away from people. When you talk about the joy, the excitement of learning against highly controlled environments that are going to make sure that you follow the rules precisely, it's a different world indeed. So I want to share a particular, as I end my statement here, but particular quote from Wired magazine from Jeff Webb, and it was an article on Say Goodbye to Privacy, and he says, smart tech, the internet, social identity, big data, cloud, mobility, all these are affected by and contribute to the emergence of the Internet of Things. That's what Lev started out talking about. Then he says it's like putting gunpowder, dynamite, nitroglycerin, and a bunch of road flares in a box and shaking them up. Something's going to happen, and happen fast. And then finally, no one will be able to escape its impact because you won't use the Internet of Things. You'll live inside it all day, every day. What is individual identity? What is privacy?
Thank you, Wendy. And I think that sets the stage nicely for Lev to take his dystopian perspective on things. Lev?
Right, and I'll be as brief as I can just because there's lots of good conversation going on in the unified chat, and I'd love to get into that. But three things just to sort of share in the way of the obvious dystopian realities that we should be mindful of. Obviously, the future is here, but unevenly distributed. That's the truth when it comes to network services and networks around the world. Certainly something we need to be very mindful of. And the challenge in many ways is that the network itself is unevenly distributed. And arguably, the realities in this country, as well as I think around the world, between the north and the south, and within our urban settings and our more wealthy and affluent suburban settings, is that the gap is not closing. The gap is actually getting bigger because, in fact, there isn't arithmetic value to the network effect. It's actually geometric. And as a result, it's very hard to see a trajectory that actually closes the gap as the network continues to evolve, and that could continue to exacerbate the haves and the have-nots. The second piece, which was actually alluded to very early on in our conversation, is the human ability, human cognition, and our ability to actually absorb what is going on. And I think it's broader than just a conversation around privacy, at least as we've talked about it this afternoon. I think it really has to do with the challenge, which takes us all the way back to the Renaissance period, of the human role in the universe. And the challenge, I think, in many ways, of the machine not only being an instrument of a human ingenuity and innovation, but I think very quickly approaching a scenario where we will see machines override human ingenuity and maybe ultimately human judgment, which I think is obviously a very difficult moment in our collective futures. And finally, I do want to say that for the last 500 years, we've had a rich conversation about the separation of public and private, and public and private spaces, public and private experiences as human beings, and I think that essentially the challenge of the immutable forces of the network actually not only blur the lines as we've experienced the last 50 years, but in the next 50 years, it's very possible that in fact they'll be turned upside down. And in addition to the obvious things like creating chambers where we're only listening to each other rather than to the public square in terms of how our ideas are shaped, I do think that just the human need for private space is something that's under assault, and that we really have to find ways of creating corrections for that, mindful of Sherry Turkle's piece in the Sunday Times, really about how conversations, intimate conversations, can be reintroduced. Of course, we know that that is part of what makes us human, and something we probably want to preserve.
Thank you, Lev. With that in mind, now that you've heard from all the panelists in their dystopian roles, I would like to ask Tom to assume the awesome responsibility of spending just a couple of minutes maybe with his reflections and summation from this dystopian perspective before we go to one question, which is I think what we'll have time for before wrapping up the panel, that is inspired by the chat. So Tom, please.
Well, okay, I'll keep it short. I think one of the watchwords that I constantly flog around, and I have to thank Gardner for this as well, is we need to keep the thoughts of Doug Engelbart in mind when we say, when we interact with technology, we have to ask ourselves the fundamental question of to what extent are we augmenting humanity, whether that be intellect or society or combined intellect, individual intellect. And as long as we keep that in mind as we build, design, and think about how we regulate or not regulate these systems, we have a chance. And if the technology, on the other hand, is used to de-augment us, then yes, we will end up in the dystopian worlds that people have been describing. And so that's what I would probably like to leave it at, in all of these things, in terms of our responsibility for expanding the network, our responsibility for respecting human individuality and learning in terms of medicine and all these other topics that come up as a result of the Internet of Things, the Internet of the network, and the privacy issues around that. As long as we do that, then we have a chance, and I think we'll be okay. If we don't, then watch out.
Thank you, Tom. So that brings to a close the presentation portion of this program, and I want to bring up a question that was triggered by what's been going on in the chat. And I think this is, the goal of today's session was to start triggering thinking. There's much more ground that needs to be covered in terms of effective preparation responses to thinking about black swans. But even just from this brief high-density introduction, we can start thinking about some possible areas. In other words, while a black swan cannot be predicted, its nesting grounds can be spotted. And in the chat, there's been a really interesting thread on demographic determinism. So I'm going to ask the panelists in closing if they could make just a quick 1 or 2 sentence statement about how the particular area they were looking at today plays out in this context, in other words, in the context of demographic determinism. So why don't we start with Lev? Want to take it first?
I would simply share that I think the conversation around ageism is temporally bounded. Our conversation around ageism is temporally bounded to the moment in time. In a 50-year emergence cycle of the network, I think it's only fair to see the dislocation and and some sense of disorientation around this issue. I'm actually very bullish in genuine terms that smart and connected health as we age, and it enables us to age in place and to create communities, sustain communities. And so I would say that this is really an area where we're going to see over the next 25 years for sure a much healthier condition that we'll be experiencing, and much more relevant and rich to the aging experience.
Thank you. That's, I think, an important perspective. Tom, you've been going last in all of these, so how about now jumping into the middle of this?
Well, I mean, I think that I tend to be a person who takes a rather long view of things. I don't think ageism is necessarily or the age thing is, there's some predictability to that. As I said in the chat, I think that age tends to make you less susceptible, in theory, to breaking out of patterns of recognition. Wisdom is another word for looking at, well, I understand the world now. Of course, young people think they understand the world too. I mean, as a father of teenagers, they know everything, correct? So I think the real differential here is whether or not the individual in question is able to break out of those molds of pattern and to be able to think, in corporate speak, outside of the box, to look at the problems from different ways. And I think a strong, broadly based education is key to being able to do that. I mean, an English major is not going to approach the problem in exactly the same way as a biologist will, or something like that. So having an understanding that there are these different approaches to things is critical to maintaining yourself in this kind of environment. And yeah, age can lead to that, but it's age often built upon decades of ignorance and poor education and exposure to simplistic and poorly designed media that play the fear button and things like that. So I mean, yeah, I mean the kind of stuff that you see that gets thrown around on Facebook about how the world is coming to an end because so and so changed their privacy policy, etc. That's a product of media hype, and you watch it over and over and over again. And there's some good people at tearing that apart. John Oliver is always a good hoot for that sort of thing. So, but unfortunately, also our Congress is very much impacted by that kind of simplistic understanding and lack of pattern recognition, recognition that they're falling into patterns that results in legislation that is poorly crafted and short-sighted. So, I mean, that's the thing. Again, that's our mission as educators. It's our mission as technologists is to break through that and to have a voice there. And that's a real challenge. I mean, these kind of gatherings are great, but we're speaking to the choir here. I mean, we're arguing with each other about points of valid points, but they're philosophical procedural points which the rest of the world could care less about most of the time, but which impacts them greatly as we move forward. So, yeah, I'm an eternal. I'm a naive pessimist, so I'm going to stick with that.
I like that way of putting it. Thank you, Tom. Let's see. Let's go to Wendy next. If you have a couple of comments or a couple of sentences.
So Ruben, I agree with what's being said, and I kind of want to be a little respectful of the time also, and stay true to the time. So I'm going to pass.
Fair enough. Brian, I'll give you the closing word for the event. What would you say?
I'd say, first of all, my thanks. My thanks to NMC for setting this up, to Gordon and Alex for working so hard behind the scenes. My thanks to my fellow panelists, to Wendy, to Lev, who I keep saying autocorrected to Len for some reason, and to my cat herders and MCers, Ruben and Tom. And especially my thanks to the people frantically typing at me from all over the world. Even Tom trying to quote from Tolstoy. I think we were talking about ageism, which is really the wrong word. I think ageism is a spin on the surface over the depths of what we're discussing. We were trying to talk about the complexity with which people interact with technology. You know, Lev brought us back to several centuries into the long view of history. I was trying to look at this sociologically, and we know that not only is the future unevenly distributed, but so is technology use. And we've seen this pretty thoroughly established by surveys over the past 20 years. I think it's important to listen to this and look at it carefully, to take a look at little kids and how they use technology, to look at people who are 80 and how they use technology. And this, I think, gives us a better chance to apprehend black swans when they happen, to see if, in the case of my area, if automation, and we see the advances of it happening in, say, elder care or in advanced medical treatments for the elderly, or will we see it in the way that 8-year-olds are so much more comfortable with robots than our 80-year-olds. Just for an optimistic way of looking at this, I'd like to recommend the excellent movie Robot and Frank, which is about an old man who gets paired up with a robot to help him deal with issues. It's a beautiful, funny, charming movie. Grab it from Netflix. I think that the best takeaway from all of this is that no one person really had a handle on this. And what we did today for an hour or so, this distributed, collective, collaborative thinking, is our best way forward.
Thank you, Brian. That's a wonderful set of words to close on, and I could not wish for better. So I think with that, I want to thank again everybody who's been on our panel today. Thank you all for being willing to, participate in this rapid-fire, highly dense thinking process that might hopefully lead us to be able to think more deeply and more effectively about black swans. Also, thank you to all our audience for joining us today. A recording of this presentation will be available to view from the NMC site. So thank you all again. I'm going to wish you all a good evening and turn it back over to Alex for any last points. Alex?
To wrap up today's program, I want to thank our moderator and panelists on behalf of the NMC for taking time to help us imagine future teaching and learning scenarios. Participants, if you want more information about anything you saw or heard today, let us know by contacting me directly at alex@nmc.org. To learn more about the future NMC Beyond the Horizon programs and to get involved with the NMC community, please visit our website at nmc.org and like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at nmc.org. Please save the date for October 28th at 5 p.m. Central Time for our next NMC Beyond the Horizon, where Jonathan Nalder will explore the SAMR model, which was developed by our moderator, Dr. Puentedura, for selecting, using, and evaluating technology in education, which currently guides the work of many projects around the world. I want to thank you for your comments today in the unified chat. It was probably one of the most robust chats that we've had in the history of this program, and that's because of you. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you with air quotes on October 28th for our next program. Have a good afternoon or evening wherever you are, and that's all for us. Thanks.